So, good morning, everybody. Our guest today is Dr. Ted Morton, one of Alberta's foremost political thinkers and a leading voice on provincial autonomy. So, Dr. Morton is a former Alberta cabinet minister, professor emeritus of political science at the University of Calgary, and co-author of the landmark 2001 Alberta Agenda, which most of you probably most know as the Alberta Firewall letter. So, which sparked the modern conversation about Alberta's role within Confederation. So his work has influenced generations, and we're seeing that come right back around today of policymakers and continues to shape the debate over Alberta's future within Canada. Welcome to the show, Dr. Morton.
Good morning, Nadine.
So we have so many topics that we could discuss this morning, and we are going to jump right in. And I have been so excited to do this interview. Thank you so very much for joining us and our viewers.
I'm happy to hopefully shed some light on some important subjects.
Wonderful. Well, you come highly recommended by, the likes of Preston Manning and Stockwell Day and Dr. Jack Mintz. And, I know you have personal relationships with so many people today that are advocating what you really started so many years ago in that Alberta Agenda. So let's dive right into that, because you were one of the co-authors of...
I was a co-author, right? I wasn't the sole author.
No. Well, I mean, brilliant brains usually come together and work collectively with other brilliant brains to kind of push forward a movement. But the reality is you were a very big part of that Firewall letter. And why don't you take us back to 2001 and maybe just set the stage as to what was going on then in Alberta that brought these brilliant minds together that said something has to change, something needs to be different here?
It was becoming clear that the Reform Party, with its regional base in the West, was not going to form a national party, or when and if it did, in order to become a national party, it would have to kind of abandon the West wants an agenda. And so I think the Firewall was an attempt to say, if we can't get more Alberta in Ottawa, which was sort of the initial plan, we need less Ottawa in Alberta. And the Firewall was like that, to kind of build a wall around Alberta to strengthen our both our self-government and also reduce our vulnerability to predatory and destructive policies from Ottawa. So policing, tax collection, and Alberta Pension Plan, those were sort of the core three initiatives that were proposed.
Now, you just brought up, it didn't look like the Reform Party was going to get, the West wants in. So it was more about how do we get some of the East out of Alberta. Do you think that there's been any real major steps made forward on that particular position to date?
Well, certainly the almost a decade of Harper government was a very happy and pleasant and positive relief from the previous almost 3 decades of either Liberals or at least prime ministers from Quebec. But post Harper, things are as bad as ever. And I think in this year, right where we are today, all the expectation was, after a decade of Justin, that we were going to get a new prime minister, Pierre Poilievre, and who understood the Western issues and the Western positions. And all the polls had him leading, 20 points, big majority. All of that changed when Trump came along and started talking 51st state. The whole election got derailed, and we ended up with Carney and another 4 or 5 years of Liberal government. So there's post-April election, I think there are a lot of people in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and actually the rest of the country too are saying, wait a minute, this isn't working. Right? And again, what do we do next?
And it's really a good point as to what we do next. But I want to touch a little bit on, because you mentioned the Stephen Harper years. So, I mean, we've had a Western prime minister, and Alberta didn't see any major changes come from that. Equalization increased, it didn't decrease. He really pushed hard. If there was one thing that Stephen Harper really did do was try and push hard for Senate reform, for example, all the way to the Supreme Court, only to have that pushed right back down. No changes were made. And, yet we
And
still.
I would just interrupt and say by what I would call a very arbitrary Supreme Court decision. What the reasoning in that decision, I've written about it. People can look it up online, but the court's reasoning in that it was very unpersuasive because it didn't change the nature of the Senate. It just said if provinces want to have elections, they can send the list of people who win them to the prime minister, and the prime minister still makes the appointment. So it was a very, very minor but important step forward, and the court just pulled the rug not only pulled the rug out from under that, but said any changes in the future to Senate reform will require a constitutional amendment. And since Quebec would never consent to a constitutional amendment, it means Senate reform, for all practical purposes, is totally off impossible. Will be impossible ever to achieve.
And so
So
I think
all the more reason then to pursue the Alberta agenda.
And I think that's where I was getting at is like we've had a Western prime minister who could not accomplish anything on that firewall agenda. Not even in my opinion personally, the Senate reform was really just a token. It was a gesture of good faith, is what it was, to say that we can make some adjustments, changes, to, include the West a little bit more, recognize the value that they contribute, and yet the East and, all the way to the Supreme Court, whether the judgment was a good one or a bad one, the end result was we have no say. And that's not going to change with the Laurentian elite running Canada from the East. So even you mentioned Pierre Poilievre, and the fact that Pierre Poilievre, would have gotten in, should have gotten in. But what really would that have changed for Albertans?
I think it would have made a difference. Pierre's a pretty unique guy. Adopted French by French Canadian parents, grew up speaking French at home, growing up in Calgary, so he covers both the French and the English, and very much a Western perspective. He was active in the Reform Party back in the 90s as a university student. That's when I first met him. So I think, again, he's constrained. He has to have he would have had a national caucus, and he'd have to pay attention to national issues. But we might get into this. There are certain things that Quebec wants now still that, and all the things we've mentioned, the firewall, Quebec already has: pensions, policing, tax collection. And Quebec wants more now. So I think Pierre might have been able to engineer kind of a less Ottawa, not just less Ottawa, more Alberta, but kind of a decentralization of kind of a move away from one size fits all, Ottawa knows best, which we've had under the Liberal governments for basically the last 50 years. So I was hopefully optimistic that would have made a difference, but thanks to Donald Trump and the 51st state BS, it changed the election completely, and all of a sudden we're left with this fellow Carney that most of us knew nothing about, and still don't know that much. Well, we know who he is and what he's done, but
regrettably, I've been in finance for a long time and following politics long enough. Regrettably, I knew exactly who he was. And if anybody took the time to even just skim the surface of his book, Values, it did not take much to realize that this man is a climate zealot. He is part of the world globalist elite, and was not going to have the influence, especially with Trump, that he claimed he would have. And it's funny, he relied heavily on his resume, but right now I think we're living in a different world of politics, especially as it relates to the United States. So he wasn't, in my opinion, the right choice. He wasn't the best choice. But unfortunately for Alberta, that's what we got. So we went from Justin Trudeau, who in my opinion was the puppet, to now we've installed the puppet master. And, I think Canadians are just a little naive somewhat to the political environment. And, we've got to make some serious change. And it does start with leadership, but it starts with grassroots. And that's the part that I love about the Alberta independence movement. It is truly a grassroots movement. People are expressing for themselves. These are not career politicians. These are people who are just, we've had enough with politics. We're done playing games. We just want the government to get out of our lives and leave us alone. Is that even possible, Mr. Morton?
Well, to go back to the election, it showed again Carney's victory, the basic political irrelevance of Western Canada. To get a majority, you need 172 seats in the House of Commons. Quebec and Ontario together have, I think, 200 seats, and they got 170 seats. 2/3 are from Quebec and Ontario. I think there are 4 MPs from Alberta and Saskatchewan. So Alberta doesn't count. They don't, and the Liberals understand that, and they cater particularly to Quebec, but also to Atlantic Canada and some of the poor eastern provinces. And you just basically take money from the resource-rich but voter-poor West and move that money to the voter-rich but resource-poor Central Canada and Atlantic Canada. And there was Trudeau won. Pierre Trudeau had a campaign manager that once said, the strategy's simple, screw the West, we'll take the rest. It worked back with the NEP in the 1980s, and in a certain sense, it's working still today for Justin and now. Well, we'll see. Well, I think the book's still, I'm willing to give Carney a little more time, but I share your skepticism.
Yeah, I think, the noose is tightening. One of the things you wrote in your book, Strong and Free. So for anybody who hasn't picked this up, this is a beautiful sort of story and lots of insights in here as to politics. So if people are interested, I think they can buy this on Amazon because I know that's where I got mine. But there's a couple of other places they can buy this as well.
It's in most Alberta bookstores, I think.
Okay, perfect. Well, in the book, you talked about how when things were the demise of the PC party and the rise of, Wild Rose was a big part of that. You talked about how these UNA parties kind of continue to grow. And in doing so, the right has really moved left of center to, kind of garner more votes from the general populace, for example. And I want to talk about
federally or even in Alberta.
I think even in Alberta, because your book.
That's part of my thesis, that what happened to the PC party, that, Lougheed, Getty, Klein, it kept moving more and more to the center and stopped being particularly conservative, and didn't pay any attention at all to the whole growth of the Reform Party and the agenda of the Reform Party.
And I think they're still doing that to a certain extent. I think even under this current conservative government, we're still seeing more appeasement to the left. Not, maybe as much as what we saw previously, but I mean, it's still that. And I mean, anytime you move to the line, you set a new baseline, right? So what was, left 30 years ago today is, looks like it's right of center, for example. But I want to ask you a question, because I asked this of Stockwell Day yesterday as well. I said, what does it mean to you to actually be conservative?
Well, I wrote a book about it. Certainly, there are a number of things. Rule of law, responsible government, accountability, balanced budgets, fiscal responsibility, and I think those are probably the basis. Rule of law, fiscal responsibility, looking after not just the present generation but the next, accountability, and I think those are the big ones, and that's what we don't have at all in the federal government as far as Western interests go.
Absolutely. You mind if we touch on some of these? Because I wrote a book called Alberta Rising, and I took an approach of writing it more for people who were a little bit left of center, trying to understand why people are so discontent with the situation with Canada right now. And I looked at it more from a principles perspective, not a policy perspective. And you've just hit on a number of the principles. We need accountability, which we don't have, and we're not getting, and I don't think even necessarily as much provincially as we should. But I want to talk, let's start with rule of law, because right now we're talking about an independence movement. And, we have in Canada nations within nations. That's a nation divided. And I think we need one rule of law that applies to everybody equally. So, I mean, one of the problems I see with government is that they're constantly trying to appease these special interest groups, whether it's the teachers union or whether it's the Indigenous population, or if it's some other group, whether it's the woke culture, cancel culture group. What are your thoughts around that? Because I've had some great conversations with Bruce Party and some other individuals, and there's really a divide right now as to, how do we fix that problem alone?
Well, just on the rule of law issue, this goes back to Magna Carta, Runnymede. It's been central to the success and growth and of not just Great Britain, but all of the British colonies, of which we're one. And but the rule of law in the past did not mean the rule of lawyers. And what's happened under the Charter of Rights since 1982, and not by accident, I think Trudeau had a design and saw this coming. The left, particularly the post-materialist left, the woke DEI left, has used the courts, and particularly the Supreme Court. Of course, they control the appointments, not just to the Supreme Court, but also all the provincial superior courts as well, to move their agenda, the DEI woke agenda, the climate change agenda, the Aboriginal stuff, into the courts and away from accountable governments. And it's all done under the name of the Charter and constitutional law. But again, in effect, and the government funds the very groups that are going to court to challenge the laws that the Liberals don't like. So the Liberals fund these different advocacy groups. The advocacy groups, in turn, of course, support the Liberals, and the judges make decisions that both groups want. So it's a vicious circle, and one in which an increasingly large number, certainly Western Canada is left out of, but an increasingly large section of all of Canadian society are left out. The left used to be the party of the people, right? They wanted plebiscites and recall and all of that. Now the left, the post-materialist left, the DEI woke left, where do they govern from? Courts, human rights commissions, bureaucracies, the United Nations, things that have very little accountability to and connection with, or even, and certainly not much affection for, grassroots interests, and particularly in our case, Western interests.
Yeah, it truly feels like the tail is wagging the dog for the most part, and it is being financed and funded, which brings us to a good question about fiscal responsibility, because the government, what is the proper role of government to begin with? Because when we established government, the government is supposed to serve the people. And yet right now it's the people that are having to ask permission of the government to do everything, including things in their personal lives. We have no property rights. COVID proved that. We have no, even self-defense is borderline. I mean, you're the criminal until you prove yourself innocent in many circumstances under the current rule of law, or rule of lawyers, as you've said, which is very accurate. So how do we reverse some of that trend?
Well, it won't be easy because it sort of reflects deeper sociological and economic trends, but certainly a start is, and I think Premier Smith has said this and is working on it, and it corresponds with something Quebec wants, is certainly for provincial superior courts, Court of King's Bench and Court of Appeal, those judges should be appointed by provincial governments. They're provincial courts, and the judges are still appointed by Ottawa. That's a leftover from the British colonial model, in 1867, where the Brits didn't trust the hinterlands, i.e., Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, BC, and so to control things, will make those appointments by Ottawa. Unfortunately, well, that's still the case, and it has led to as I've just said, the rule of lawyers, woke DEI lawyers, and less accountable to people. So one start would be, a simple one would be for certainly all Superior Court judges, Court of Appeal, Court of King's Bench, and Court of Appeal judges, not just in Alberta, but in every province, should be appointed by provincial governments. And then the Supreme Court, and this was actually in the Meech Lake Accord, each province should have an allocation of some seats on the court, and they should either be able to name the judges that come from their province, or at least give a list of judges to the federal government that they would choose from that list. And that sounds like a challenge, but actually that was part of the Meech Lake Accord back 40 years ago. So it's doable, and Quebec would support, and I think most other provinces would support those changes. So that's a start.
I think Quebec right now is terrified that Alberta gets to independence before they do.
Well, I was just at a conference in BC, and I sat next to a guy, Guillaume Rousseau. He's from Quebec. He was one of the co-authors of that big Quebec document, 50 different changes that the Quebec government wants, that was published last fall. And we compared notes with Alberta and Quebec, and I said, Alberta would be quite happy with at least 40 of the things you're asking for there. And so there's a possibility going forward, particularly if there's some referendums, for Quebec and Alberta to work together. And as I said a moment ago, I think it's not just Quebec and Alberta. I think there's a sense in Canada that the one size fits all, Ottawa knows best model that's really we've lived with for the last, since Trudeau won. It's not working. Economically, we're a mess. Politically, we're very divided. And so maybe a decentralization, not just on a Western basis, but everywhere, could be a very positive change for all of Canada.
Yeah, I think so many Albertans, I know there's been a lot of frustration and anger with Quebec, but the reality is I think we have more in common than we do difference, because, what Quebec does have, Quebec has fought for. And, they've just fought harder, and with, the population and the political system, they've had certainly more leverage and have accomplished more. But it doesn't, that's a political issue, not a people issue per se. So, I think Alberta has just as much a unique culture and a heritage as Quebec does. And, being the economic engine that's really financed disproportionately, to Quebec, unfortunately, has created a lot of bitterness towards Quebecers. But, I think we could take a good look at their playbook and go, okay, well, it's worked for them. It's time that we start implementing some of the strategies right here at home. And if they have it, constitutionally, there is really no reason why we shouldn't have it. But it does take political will. And that is something that Quebec has always had. And what I've seen here in Alberta is our politicians keep trying to fix a broken system, where they have no leverage and no power, no influence to even really come to the table. What I've seen with this Alberta independence movement is finally, because if we can get to yes on a referendum, that opens the channel, the door, that gives us some leverage to either be able to negotiate a better deal, or we can separate, or, we can become whatever we want to become. But there's
a bunch of things in between the status quo and separation, which I think would satisfy, I would guess, 60 to 70% of Albertans. And but to your point, if Quebec had been treated like Alberta's been treated for the last 50 years, Quebec would have left long ago. And more to the point, second point, if Albertans had a chance to renegotiate our relationship with the rest of Canada, we would never accept the status quo. And we don't have to accept the status quo. And I guess I'm giving sounds like a little more credit to Premier Danielle Smith than you are, that she's you know she's opened the door to the referendum. She's had the next panel. They've identified changes. Almost all of the firewall reforms seem to be part of those changes. And it looks like we might have a referendums on those specifics. So I think we're Albertans. Maybe 20% of people who don't pay attention to anything like the status quo. And I'd be curious to what you think the separatist sentiment is. Now, I still think it's in the 25%, but that still leaves 60% of Albertans somewhere in between. And I'm hoping that what she's starting, and particularly if we have these referendums next year, that it's a step for change and much needed change.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I mean she's doing the Alberta Next panel, but even when I read your book, I just look at this and I go, "Here's more of the same, more of the same, more of the same." I see it more as a stall tactic, in hopes that sentiment does change and to kind of slow the momentum down on the independent side. Because we've had 3 different panels, including the Alberta Next panel now, at different points of Alberta's history. And we just seem to keep spinning our wheels. Like, when are we going to stop spinning our wheels and recognize that, Alberta right now, as far as the East is concerned, has a lot of bark, but not a lot of bite because we don't have any political leverage. So wouldn't a true referendum on independence provide Alberta with some of that leverage to actually come to the table, either to negotiate a better contract with Ottawa, or potentially leave?
Well, again, I'd go back to what I said earlier. I think the most effective way for Alberta to get some of these concessions is to coordinate with Quebec. Because right now there's a real, Quebec's in a position now, and Carney's going to have to deal with this. The Separatist Party look like they're going to win the next election in Quebec. So there's an opportunity for us to hitch our wagon, so to speak, to the Quebec wagon. That list of 50 changes that was sent out last fall, those would be quite popular, I think. And again, like the firewall, all these things, policing, tax collection, pensions, these aren't radical. I mean, Quebec already does them. There's no reason why Alberta or BC could not do it as well. But again, to come back to the position that I think you're at, put yourself, instead of you and I have the luxury of sitting in our offices and being able to talk about this, but put yourself in Danielle Smith's and the UCP's position. The worst thing that could happen to Alberta and would set back all of this is in the next election, which is now only 2 years away, right? In Alberta, 2027, is a divided vote, a rerun of 2017 to 2015, where you divide the conservative vote between a separatist party or a more separatist party, and then you elect the NDP. If you think 5 years of NDP was bad from 2015 to 2019, imagine 5 years with Naheed Nenshi as the premier of Alberta. So again, I can appreciate your impatience and the impatience of a lot of other people in the independence movement, but I think the nature of politics, and again, democratic politics, is there's a certain gradualism or step by step, and I think Premier Smith is taking us in the direction that you want to go, the separatists want to go, but there's something, again, well short of not the status quo, not separation. There's a place for much greater autonomy with the right kind of reforms that would keep not just a strong and prosperous Alberta, but a strong and prosperous Canada.
So here's a question for you, and I'm being tough on you today,
Okay.
because here's the reality, though. All those things we've talked about in that Alberta Firewall are all things that provincially our politicians have had the control over and could have implemented at any given time. So here's why I'm so tough on Danielle, because I think politicians need to be pushed and they need public pressure to do that. And if I get to be the villain, then that's okay. I'm more concerned about the outcome than the interim steps. So here's the thing, though, like even on the pension plan, when, she came out with the pension plan, we came out with a fury. Lots of support for that. That was something that with the stroke of a pen, she could have done. And she chose not to, which is okay. We could have had an informal referendum on it, whatever. But what she did was she put into legislature an obstacle, not only in her path, but every future government's path down the road, that says that now there must be a referendum on this particular issue. So, it's things like that I look at and going, why has Jason Kenney, I'll pick on Jason Kenney for a little bit. They've all had the opportunity to say, you know what? Alberta's going to have its own pension plan. You know what? Alberta's going to collect its own taxes. Alberta's going to have its own police force because it's already within the provincial legislation, the provincial jurisdiction. We have the power to do that. We just have not had any political leader step up to the plate and truly lead, because right now what I see is managed decline in Canada, lead the charge and make this happen. So, I mean, this is 50, 60 years. This is beyond impatience, I think. And to the point where we keep revisiting the same thing, and then the same political strategies keep being deployed against the people in a new generation who maybe don't necessarily have the full history. So how do we get our politicians to get on board with actually doing some of these things? Because it's within their control to do so right now.
I don't normally say positive things about the Supreme Court of Canada, and it deserves to be criticized for much of what it's done for the last 4 decades. But in the Quebec secession reference 30 years ago, they stated very clearly that if there's a clear majority on a clear question of constitutional change, then the rest of Canada has a constitutional duty to negotiate. And I think what the advantage of of connecting these things with a referendum is that you get to build on the very foundation that the Supreme Court created in that case. A clear majority on a clear question creates a constitutional duty to negotiate. And so I think it's not just a question of winning a majority here. First, you have to win a majority here in Alberta, but then secondly, you have to go to the rest of Canada and get that change. And that's not easy. And if you have the power of if you've had a referendum and there's a clear majority on a clear question, then Premier Danielle Smith, whoever the premier might be, or whoever the leader of Alberta might be, can go to Ottawa and the other provinces and say, I have a mandate. This isn't just me and my caucus. This is a mandate from the people of Alberta for change. And the Supreme Court said that when we have a referendum like we did and there's a clear majority on a clear question, you guys have to talk. So it increases the leverage that Premier Smith or the next, whoever the leader of Alberta is at this point, to get those concessions done. So I would, people accuse me of being impatient. I can see your patience has worn out. But,
well, it's not worn out. I mean, it's just, for me, I'm tired of the politics, I guess. And I think that's where most Albertans are at, is we just see the political games, the political strategies that are being used to kind of, temper this down. So let's take the example of the referendum question. I don't think anybody would object to having a question. Right. Let's have a clear question on whether or not Albertans want to leave or want to stay. Now, Danielle Smith herself has said it is her job to make sure that we do not get there. I was in the room with her when she said that statement, is to make sure that we do not get there. She doesn't want the referendum question on separation. But I think that would clear up much of this. And either A, we're going to move forward or we're not. And it would give her that public support one way or the other. But the reality is, even on the question that the Alberta Prosperity Project put forward, that now is in front of the courts. And that's not in front of the courts because of federally it has to be there. It's in front of the courts because of a provincial legislation that was put there. She put legislation into place that said that the Citizens Initiative Act could not violate the Constitution, sections 1 to 35.1. Well, this is the very Constitution, to your point, we're trying to get out from under. And yet now it's in front of the courts where it shouldn't belong because this is a grassroots movement. So these are I think the political frustrations and where much of the impatience come from. And I think, again, it boils down to provincially, we have to have the political will and the leadership to push this movement forward, one way or the other.
Okay, well, to go back to, I think, a question I posed, I guess, rhetorically earlier, but I'll be specific now. If on the proposed separation question, if there were a referendum, what do you think the vote would be? What percentage?
I think we would be pleasantly surprised if we set a date. I think there's enough people that would volunteer their time to get out to educate people to what the real grievances are and to understand that if Alberta wants any change, anything other than the status quo, I think it starts with yes on a referendum. Because unfortunately, we don't have the population, we don't have the political leverage, we're not going to get the constitutional changes. So I think upwards of 40% today are either a solid yes or leaning that way.
The leaning doesn't count. They got to
be willing. Absolutely.
The Alberta Prosperity Project goes for that there's not a maybe. That's yes or no.
Yep, absolutely.
Here's just a counter argument that I think you should think about is that if the vote is 35% yes on that, that's a big vote, but it's still not even close to a majority. And so what happens next? The rest of Canada says, well, 2/3 of Albertans don't want to separate, so we can ignore them. And the 1/3 that voted yes, then, well, if the UCP is not going to do something, let's go form our own party and we'll take it from there. Well, whoa! All of a sudden we're back to 2015, divided. Wild Rose, conservative. Who wins? Neither party wins, and you get in the head, Ninchi.
Let's explore that.
All I'm saying is there's a risk. There's a risk of that. And did you see? Did you see the proposal that I wrote about a couple months ago about a 2-question referendum?
Yes, I did.
Question 1 is, are you satisfied with the status quo? I'm confident there that the answer for Albertans would be 80% no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Agreed.
And then question 2 is, if you answered question 1 no, then which of the following would you like to see the Alberta government pursue? And then you give Albertans a choice. Again, at one end is some policy changes that Premier Smith has talked about and identified, and the other end is separation, all straight out separation. And then that gives Albertans a choice to say which of, at least for the next 4 or 5 years, which of these changes do you want the government to pursue? And I think that would be a more productive step forward than the straight yes or no on separation, because the risk of, if the answer is no, 20, 30, 40%, or only 20 or 30% vote yes for separation, the rest of Canada can say, well, you see, Quebec, Alberta's going nowhere. But those people who worked for that are going to say, no, we're going to go somewhere. We're going to form our own party. Whoa, then we're back to vote splitting. So that's a scenario that you can't discount because we've lived through it once.
But being the devil's advocate, we have lived through it once. And guess what? If we do nothing, we're already getting the ignored, right? So really, I'm looking at it from a risk-reward perspective. What do we got to lose to kind of set a date, put the number out there, because people right now are dismissing this movement at, it's 10% of the population. I don't think it's 10% of the population. I think it is significantly more than that. And I think that in of itself would prove a lot to the rest of Canada that this movement has grown and will continue to grow if you choose to ignore us. So, I mean, how do you do that if you don't at least establish a baseline? Because my fear, and much like yours, is that if Danielle does not give a referendum, you will see more independence parties start. So, and that's where the real risk, in my opinion, does lie. If she does not give an honest referendum question on independence, I think that is where you are going to see new parties form, not the other way around. I think if she does it and we lose, I think we're all adults in the room, and I think we'll go, okay, not yet. Not this time, but let's implement some of these things like the Alberta Pension Plan, the police force, the revenue, and garner more autonomy, and we'll try again. But if we don't try now, I think honestly, to your point, I think we are going to see. We've already seen new parties start. The Alberta Prosperity Project has already registered a political party under that name, and I think we are going to see splinters on the right if she doesn't follow through with a question. Thoughts?
I think the risk of a new party on a single question vote is, and then vote splitting, and then getting 5 years of a government in Alberta, which isn't interested at all in all the issues and in unfairness and the changes that we've been talking about. That's a big risk. That could set things back a lot further. Whereas the what I've called the two-question referendum, where 80% of the people say, no, we don't accept the status quo, we want change. And then, well, what kind of change? And then you have a menu, 3 or 4 options, from simply policy changes to structural constitutional changes to outright separation. And then you got a working plan for the next 4 or 5 years, and with I think a mandate that the rest of Canada can see. They may not like it, but they can see it's there. And then 2, if you can tag up with Quebec and do some demands together. Here's an idea. What if Quebec and Alberta had referendums on the same question on the same day next year?
Yeah, no, like I said,
That'd be hard to ignore.
Absolutely it would. But the difference being is Quebec actually has political leverage because they get to determine who the next federal government will be. We do not. So this is my struggle with Alberta's politics. And this is where my empathy for Albertans really does shine through, because we have no leverage, right? We really honestly have no leverage. Ottawa has
proven by the April election.
Right, as proven by the last 120 years. Like we have been the welcome mat, wipe the feet off. It's really been criminal, actually, how Albertans have been treated. And I'm going to be honest, I don't think the people in the East truly fully understand the situation. So many people go, oh, there's the whininess. And I have lived in the East. I was born in the East, in Labrador. And I've lived all across this country, and Alberta is my home, and it has been my home for 20 plus years. My daughter is born and raised here. My husband is an Albertan, born and raised. And when I see how Albertans are often dismissed, is the best way, and ignored, it shocks me, because we are the breadbasket of this country. And, Albertans are the most...
I agree with everything you've said in the last 90 seconds, but we have not yet persuaded, in my view, we have not yet persuaded a majority of Albertans that to be where we are. And I think probably the support for outright separation is double today what it was 30 years ago. And so that's changed for reasons that we've both identified. But again, having a referendum right now, if all you get is 20 to 30% on the let's leave now, the rest of Canada can say, well, don't worry about Alberta. And then two, the risk of vote splitting. So I think there's a more gradual, incremental approach that I've suggested that I think has less of a risk of the downside.
I think so. I'm going to throw something else at you. And thank you so much for participating in the conversation because I think viewers are tired of the safe questions and, people want to see the debate, the discussion, the conversation. And the beauty I find, at least with conservatives, is we can have that and we're still going to be friends at the end of the day. Like nobody has to get mad. We can agree to disagree on things, but at least the discussion is had, which, triggers, I think, questions in other people's minds that allow them to then decide for themselves what side of this fence that they sit on. So thank you so much for participating this morning because none of this is scripted, folks. This is off the cuff. And as a matter of fact, the questions I had highlighted, I don't think I've asked. I started with one. We've kind of taken on a life of its own. But so here's the thing though. We have new immigrants coming into Alberta. Not only like from other parts of the world, but from Ontario and BC who don't always share Alberta's sentiments. And here's my bigger concern. We have seen the biggest government we have ever seen under this supposed conservative government under Danielle Smith with the biggest budgets. And more money's going to unions through teachers and nurses who typically tend to vote left, not right. I think we move further away from the goalpost just with those two things alone if we don't start behaving like conservatives. And that means we have to reduce, in my opinion, the size of government. And we have to reduce the power of government. We have to give back to the people the power that belongs to them, like educational choice, which I know you're a big advocate of. Health choice is the same thing. Right now, we have a monopoly healthcare system. And, those are things that need to be fixed. And throwing more money at those only makes matters worse. It doesn't actually help the situation. So again, this is coming back to the political will and leadership. So how do you feel about getting back into politics?
I am definitely not getting back into politics. And I value my marriage too much to do that again. But again, I would give Danielle Smith a little more credit than you are. I mean, she has increased support for parental choice in not just the separate school system, but private schools as well. And what was the other topic you were just mentioned?
Immigration, healthcare, government spending, as well as size.
Healthcare, something that I was starting to do, and of course Stelmach didn't like it, was private delivery of publicly supported, publicly funded healthcare. The problem both with our healthcare system and our education system, it sounds great, public system, public health for the people. All bureaucracies are inefficient. Public bureaucracies are even more inefficient. And once the people who run the public bureaucracies unionize, which ATA and the various public sector bureaucracies, instead of schools being run for students, they're run for the teachers. And instead of hospitals being run for the ultimate end result for patients, it's run for doctors and nurses. And even at the universities are run first and foremost for the interests of the professors, and secondly, it's not because professors or teachers or nurses are bad people. It's just all of us have a self-interest. So these big public sector monopolies of important services, healthcare, education, and so forth, it's a downsize to the welfare state that was not so obvious a couple decades ago. I think it's quite obvious now. And again, I think the UCP and I mean, you obviously see the downside of it. We all do. Well, not everybody, but you and I certainly do. And I think the UCP and Premier Smith are taking steps to begin that change, but not fast enough and large enough for you.
It's funny. We had the conversation with Stockwell Day, and one of his comments, especially about the universities and the education system, is that the system is culturally Marxist. And unfortunately, I think the healthcare system, our education system, there's so many systems that have, gone so far to the left. I think we do almost need a little bit more, pressure put on to take some more bigger steps, I guess is my position, back to the right to find that balance. But I think that means that government has to become more restricted and smaller. And, to your point, everybody has a self-interest. Bureaucracies don't want to, make themselves less relevant. They want to make themselves more relevant. So, how do we correct some of these fundamental and structural issues, with our bureaucracies? One of my ideas is term limits.
But
So,
to make those policy changes, you have to win elections. And to win elections, you have to persuade a majority of people to elect a majority of, if we're talking provincially, a majority of MLAs to support those changes. And
but to your
so
point, you get
I applaud what you're doing. And obviously, I spent a good portion of my adult life, both before politics and during politics, and now after politics, trying to persuade Albertans that the system's broken, certainly federally, and that we need more change. And we've made progress. More and more people agree with us, but I still don't think we're at a clear majority yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think we certainly agree on more than we disagree. I might just push a little harder, maybe.
We clearly agree on the nature of the problem, on how to solve the problem, and I guess we have some disagreements.
Yeah, you bet. Well, I want to
The
respect.
scope and space of how to solve the problems.
Well, it's through the conversation and it's through the debate like this that we find the best outcome, right? We find the best solution, the best path forward. So that's the purpose of these podcasts, is to bring people on to share different ideas and different viewpoints.
I applaud you for contributing to that collective conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. So I do want to respect your time. If you right now were drafting a new Alberta agenda, what would it include?
Again, I'll very modest. I'd start with the three we've already have out there, and that Quebec already does: policing, pensions, and tax collection. That increases autonomy. To that, I would add, as I mentioned before, the provincial appointment of provincial superior court and court of appeal judges. The rule of law does not have to mean the rule of lawyers, particularly liberal lawyers or particularly woke DEI lawyers, which is what we get with the status quo. So those are, and again, three of those reforms Quebec already does, and the fourth, the judicial appointments, not only would Quebec support it, I think almost every other province would. What provincial premier, what provincial party wants to campaign to have their provincial judges appointed by Ottawa? I don't think there'd be too many.
So then, with that in mind, any final statements? Obviously, I want to again promote, your book, Strong and Free, available on Amazon. It is very enlightening. There were some stories in here and some insights that I think you have a firm grasp of the situation as far as the Alberta independence. And I think realistically, the sentiment has just become a little bit more, I guess, no, I don't want to say force, but I think that the difference between then and now, I think, is the track record, the history of, having done this numerous times. And I think that's where much of the impatience comes from. So for those people who right now who think that separation is the path forward, what would your advice to them be?
Keep having that conversation with other Albertans who aren't there yet. Because again, to do any of the changes that you're talking about or that we're talking about, you need to form a government, which means you need a majority of MLAs. And you said earlier, what are the key parts of what a just and responsible? What are the key elements of good government? Well, part of it's responsibility, i.e., accountability of government, of accountability of the lawmakers to the voters and to the taxpayers. And we've persuaded a lot more Albertans that change has to come. The status quo is not acceptable. We're way ahead of where we were 20, 30 years ago. Just look what happened to me and 20 years ago and where Jason and Danielle have gotten us today. That's part of the story of the book, right? Because of accountability, it takes time to persuade people to change their opinions. And it's happening, but obviously not as fast as you would like to see it happen.
Well, that was part of my reason for writing my book, was to start the conversation. So the book is not written from a policy standpoint. It was, here's how I've been selling my book, is like, buy 2 copies. You read one, you give the other one out to a friend. You tell that friend you're going to meet them on Saturday for coffee, and tell me what you disagree with.
Good for you.
Start the conversation. So on that note, I think we will end this interview, and I hope we get to do this again. If you're up for that, maybe in a couple of months, we can revisit some of the issues and see where things currently stand.
Well, again, I think that's a good idea. And of course, just in the last week, 7 days, there's been an announcement of a big initiative on the pipeline consortium to the West Coast. And so we briefly referenced Carney already. And as we've all noticed, he's been much better on talk than action so far. Well, now there's something out there to act on. And if he keeps talking but doesn't act, then things move, I'd say, further in the direction that important fundamental change has to happen. Because if that's the case, it turns out the Carney Liberals aren't any different than the Trudeau Liberals, and the status quo is not acceptable. So then what? So yeah, let's get together in a couple of months and see what happens.
Yeah, I think we could probably do an entire episode on Premier Eby, actually.
Well, again, the Prime Minister, the federal government has interprovincial transportation and trade is clearly a federal jurisdiction. And again, to go back, if we had Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre, I think a pipeline to the West Coast would have been a priority for him. And neither the Premier of BC nor the Aboriginal issues, I think, could have stopped that.
I totally agree. So with that in mind, I'm going to say thank you so very much for joining me today and participating as wholeheartedly into the conversation. And I do sincerely hope we do this again. So
we'll see you in the new year.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, everybody, please do like, share this video. Please leave us your comments if there's things that you liked, parts of this that you'd like us to go deeper into, or that you feel we've skimmed over. Give us your opinions. What is it that you'd like us to discuss next? So God bless everybody. Thank you so much. Please do like, share, subscribe, and have a great day.